Many of the crimes we've discussed in the past have an immense impact on one or more particular families and their local communities, but some cases reach beyond that. Some cases, for better or for worse, have lasting ramifications that can affect a state, a country, or even the entire world. Today, we're talking about the criminal impact of Kendra's Law and how it attempts to protect the public's safety while dancing a very fine line on a portion of our population. New York City, January 3rd, 1999. 32-year-old Kendra Ann Webdale stood alongside the subway tracks as she waited for her train. She had recently moved from her hometown of Fredonia, New York, to Manhattan to explore life in the big city, and she had hopes of becoming a screenwriter. She had previously worked as a freelance photographer as well as a newspaper editor for two weekly newspapers in Boston. Unfortunately for her, on that day, she was to encounter a tortured individual in desperate need of help. A young man approached her and asked her for the time. She smiled and looked to her watch, but the next thing she knew, she was flung forward, off the platform and onto the tracks. An inbound train struck and killed her. Her attacker was a man named Andrew Goldstein. 29-year-old Andrew Goldstein had a long history of assaults, mostly against women, attributed to his long battle with schizophrenia. He had not always struggled with mental health problems, however. Andrew had even attended the Bronx High School of Science, a public specialized high school that not only focuses on math and science, but humanities and social sciences. The school has 9 Nobel Prize-winning alumni, but Andrew would not be one of those. He began to struggle with mental illness in his first year of college. He was suffering severe delusions, and soon his episodes were spilling over into actions and affecting the people around him. His first assault was against his mother in 1989 when he violently knocked her into a wall. If there was any upside to this event, it was that it brought Andrew into the state of New York's mental health system, where he did receive care. However, it was sporadic on an uneven schedule. He was prescribed Haldol, a medicine that would keep his delusions under control, but he would also suffer the side effects of the drug. This would eventually lead him to stop taking that drug, and of course, when he didn't take his medication, his behavior grew more and more erratic, leading to other violent outbursts. Andrew had been released from North General Hospital less than 3 weeks before his attack on Kendra. In his case, the state of New York's mental health system not only failed Andrew Goldstein. In doing so, it also failed Kendra and the entire Webdale family. The shocking murder brought these failings to the attention of the people of New York, and it was obvious that something had to be done to prevent such acts. Andrew Goldstein was charged with second-degree murder, and this time prosecutors were out to make it stick. However, as his medical history was investigated and publicized, it was clear that Goldstein had been bounced from one hospital to the other throughout the city of New York for many years. In one doctor's notes, Andrew Goldstein had literally begged for help because he just wanted a normal life. Acts of his violent behavior while in these hospitals were also well documented, and it appears that the hospitals turned him away, perhaps in some effort to protect their staff rather than helping him. Patricia Webdale, Kendra's mother, would file a lawsuit against New York City hospitals: North General Hospital, Brookdale University Hospital, Jamaica Hospital, Long Island Jewish Hillside Hospital, Bleuler Psychotherapy Center, New York Psychotherapy and Counseling Center, and the Levin Home for Adults. 7 hospitals. 7 voluntary attempts on Andrew Goldstein's behalf, the man desperately seeking help for the mental illness he was experiencing. Imagine the sheer number of employees that he interacted with. How many opportunities was he trying to take to find a path through all that difficulty that he was facing? It's not always a perspective that we can easily take with cases like this, and I think that Kendra's mother's actions highlight a level of understanding and compassion that somehow exceeds the feeling of tragic loss that she experienced. If this was an issue of a system failing Andrew and ultimately Kendra Webdale, Patricia was going to show that. and just maybe make things better for others in similar situations. And I don't want to gloss over the other side of this reality. I mean, certainly Goldstein's violent behavior was a major detriment in his attempts to find help. It was found that he attacked 13 medical staff members during this time, and he wound up with no choice but to live in a one-room apartment with a disability check that covered his rent and not much else. Social workers tried to get Goldstein admittance into a hospital, but that also failed. It's a challenging situation from all sides. And keep in mind, there was 2 court cases going on around this now. We have the civil trial and also a criminal trial. To make things even worse, jurors were deadlocked over the murder trial. 2 of the jurors insisted that Andrew Goldstein was dealing with mental illness and should have been found not guilty by reason of insanity. This deadlock would ultimately result in a mistrial. Andrew Goldstein would be tried again, and in the second trial, he was found mentally competent to stand trial, and he was also found guilty. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison. 16 of those years were spent in the mental ward of the Sullivan Correctional Facility until he was transferred to Sing Sing to serve out the rest of his sentence. As Patricia Webdale's civil lawsuit progressed, there were other tragedies at the tracks. Just 3 months after the death of Kendra Webdale, another victim, Edgar Rivera, was shoved in front of another approaching train. Rivera survived, however, he lost his legs. 47-year-old Paul O'Dwyer also attacked 4 people on the subway at the West 4th Street station. O'Dwyer grabbed Cheyenne Spotto by her hair and tried to drag her toward a moving train. Spotto held onto a pillar and screamed for her life until a Good Samaritan stepped in and attacked O'Dwyer. He then fled to another subway station in Soho, where he attempted to do the same thing twice more. He was thankfully unsuccessful in his further attacks, and he surrendered to a policeman without a fight when he was approached by them. Governor George Pataki would sign off on Kendra's law in November of 1999, mandating court-appointed assistant outpatient treatment for certain people with mental illness who, in view of their treatment history and present circumstances, are unlikely to survive safely in the community without supervision. This law addresses difficult cases like Andrew Goldstein's and assigns a case manager to a mentally ill individual with violent tendencies. The patient is required to follow treatment plans, which includes enforcing the continued use of prescribed medications. If the patient fails to follow through with the plan, the case manager can have the individual committed to a mental facility. To this day, there are calls to further strengthen the law. In May of 2023, New York City Mayor Eric Adams held a press conference and spoke about the case of Jordan Neely, a mentally unstable individual that had checked himself out of the mental health facility that he had agreed to attend after committing an assault back in 2021. The arrangement was part of a plea deal that kept him out of prison, but a loophole exists which allowed Neely to choose to leave the institution. Even while a bench warrant for his arrest was being drawn up, Jordan Neely was on the streets. 3 months later, and off his medication, Neely spiraled out of control in a New York City subway station and was forcibly restrained by former Marine Daniel Penny. Unfortunately, Penny had placed Neely in a lethal chokehold, and he held that until Neely was killed. There are numerous other details and aspects to this case, which is due for trial later this year. However, in relation to our conversation here today, Mayor Adams stated that the loophole in the current version of Kendra's law needed to be changed because it was that loophole which allowed Jordan Neely to be in that situation. But changes come slowly to laws, and there are some people in need of mental health assistance that will continue to fall through the cracks. For instance, as recently as January 22, 2022, another incident of attempted murder in the New York subway occurred. 40-year-old Michelle Alyssa Go awaited her train at the Times Square 42nd Street station when a man experiencing mental illness shoved her from behind. Michelle was struck and instantly killed by the approaching train. Like Andrew Goldstein, her killer, 61-year-old Marshall Simon, had been shuffled from one New York institution to the other for years. Instead of receiving continued care and sustained help for his illness, he walked the streets freely. In 2022, at the Howard Beach A train station, 33-year-old Elizabeth Gomez, a security guard at Kennedy Airport, was on her way to work when she was randomly targeted by a homeless man. The attack was so brutal that she would lose the sight in her right eye. Her attacker, 42-year-old Waheem Foster, was out on parole when he snapped and assaulted Gomez. Foster is another example of a repeat offender with known mental health issues, a diagnosed schizophrenic that murdered his own grandmother when he was 14 years old. Even though he was indicted for the attack on Gomez, he was later found to be mentally incompetent to stand trial and is in the hands of the Office of Mental Health. Foster is close to being a worst-case scenario for the system, as many people believe that he should be in jail for violating his parole on the day of his attack on Gomez. I think most would agree that someone like Foster shouldn't be wandering the streets. He has a repeated pattern of attacking women, and he's murdered in the past. It's clear that he should either be in prison for his crimes or be in a high-security mental facility getting treatment for his illness, especially if he's been found mentally incompetent to be charged for those crimes. Kendra's law seems like a step in the right direction, but it seems that more steps are needed. New York's recent Less is More Act, effective March 1st of 2022, seems to fly in the face of Kendra's law. It makes it more difficult for parole officers to prove that a subject has violated parole and further slows down the process of returning a violator to prison for small technical violations of the terms of their parole. In the example of Waheem Foster, that means that his parole violation might not have taken him back into custody. In several of the cases that we've reviewed here today, weakening mechanisms like parole certainly seems like a big step backwards from empowering our systems to protect not only the public, not only the victims, but in some cases, even protect the offenders from themselves. Speaking of parole, it may come as a shock to learn that Andrew Goldstein, Kendra's murderer, was released on parole in 2018 with 5 years of psychiatric supervision. The Office of Mental Health has publicly stated that they will not divulge Goldstein's location or the status of his custody. Kendra's law is subject to renewal every 5 years, but lawmakers like New York State Senator George Borrello insist that it should be strengthened and made permanent. The belief being that the law could be more effective if longer stays in hospitals were mandated, especially when court-ordered medication regimen is not followed by the patient. It's certainly easy to understand the challenge. Historically, the time limit for such hospital stays is only 72 hours. A mere 3 days may not be enough for doctors to diagnose a patient's issue, prescribe medication, and observe the effects of that medication. Borrello, who actually knew Kendra Webdale back in their high school days, he's publicly stated, "We have turned the city streets into mental hospitals and allowed people to suffer without treatment." The World Health Organization states that mental health is a basic human right for all people. It says that everyone, whoever and wherever they are, has a deserving and inherent right to the highest attainable standard of mental health and the right to liberty, independence, and inclusion in the community. Kendra's story begs to ask, is the highest attainable standard of mental health being offered to everyone? And maybe, more importantly, does a person have the right to not accept treatment? The American Civil Liberties Union has attacked Kendra's law in the past, stating that implementing medical treatment or confining mentally ill people violates their civil liberties. And here, even for myself, I find that both sides of the argument are standing on solid ground. The question I get stuck on is that question about denying the treatment. At what point does that decision become some form of premeditation or endorsement for the acts that follow it? As Ralph Webdale, Kendra's brother, once said, "I'd rather infringe on the civil liberties of a violent person than infringe on women afraid to take the subway." He also notes that his sister was an extremely happy and friendly person, making her the perfect victim. On the day that she was murdered, another woman, some 100 feet from Kendra, also with blonde hair, was approached by Goldstein, and he also asked her for the time. The surviving woman's reply to him? Get away from me. Ralph makes a very good point about who exactly is being infringed upon here. How many people have to be attacked or pushed in front of trains before we get people on both sides of the civil rights argument to look at the issue together and decide things have to change? Can't we find a way to both provide people experiencing issues with mental illness the help that they need while providing the public the protection that we deserve and pay for? I'm not saying I have the answer. I certainly don't. But maybe Kendra's Law can continue to foster meaningful conversations that will lead to better solutions to address both sides of that equation. It also serves as a very strong reminder for not only the public in terms of our personal safety, but a reminder of the love that a mother has for her lost daughter.